Hi, welcome back to Mr. Ant's World of Prints. 4th day of November, we need a purple high. Well, it was the 4th day, but not quite the purple high we had expected. This was the Beautiful One's official UK book launch. In early October, Penguin Live announced plans for a launch event for Prince's highly anticipated memoir, bringing together the best in poets, writers, musicians and artists, and including a Q&A with Dan Pipenbring, co-author of the book, who was chosen by Prince to work with him during the last 3 months of his life. Billed as part tribute, part gig, and with a copy of the book for the £25 ticket, it sounded an intriguing event. The reality, however, was quite different. I attended the event with the Night Child and Mr. Purple music, and none of us knew quite what to expect. There's going to be artists, writers, musicians, poets. I imagined maybe different areas where you could stroll around and look at artwork of Prince, maybe even artwork for sale. A performance area maybe where poets would recite their poems about and inspired by Prince. A dance floor where a DJ would play Prince tracks and deep cuts. And then the night's highlight, the Q&A with Dan Pipenbring, and a chance to ask him questions about the short but incredible time he knew and worked with Prince. So he headed with cautious excitement to the venue, a former Art Deco cinema that had closed its doors for the last time back in 1984, ironically the year Purple Rain was released. And I checked, but the last film ever shown at the cinema was Scarface. I mean, come on, that would have been too spooky. Anyway, since its closure, the building had been split up, with the main auditorium left locked up to decay. As such, the main foyer and front of the old cinema no longer exists, and is just a row of shops. You could have easily walked past the building without even realising it's there. Upon arrival, there was a small queue waiting behind a gated off section, but before we had time to even work out if we needed to queue, we were ushered into a door and up some stairs, where we had to show our tickets before heading into a bar area, where upon entry you received your copy of the book. I've still no idea what the queue outside was for, or if we queue jumped without even knowing, or were there a VIP queue? We just never found out. We got some drinks, found a place to sit and chilled. There didn't seem to be much information on what was going to happen and where we had to go. After half an hour or so, word just seemed to spread that we needed to move into whatever space the evening was starting in. We eventually ended up in the main performance space, the former balcony of the old cinema's main auditorium, which now has a stage constructed at the front. All the seating has been removed to a wooden floor and staircasing, but many of the Art Deco features on the walls and ceiling remain. I have to admit I have a kind of nerdy love for these old buildings, and I find myself imagining who's been here before or what shows or films have graced these old walls in the past, and how did it look in its heyday. We found ourselves a place to sit and settled down for things to start. A few days before this event, it was announced that a well-known Prince photographer would be flying in to be there. That turned out to be Afshin Shahidi, who we actually passed on the stairs on our way into the venue and then again on our way out. Was he going to be part of tonight's proceedings? Maybe a Q&A, maybe some pictures on display or to buy, like his own exhibition that was held in London earlier this year? The answer was unfortunately no. On the stage in front of us were 2 screens that were displaying some of Afshin's pictures of Prince on repeat. That was apparently his contribution. He flew to the UK for this. While we were waiting for the evening to get underway, we looked around for any recognisable faces. Martin Hommett was in the house, the Violet Reality too. We saw Lee of Prince Party UK and struck up a conversation about all things Prince and the possibility of staging a Prince Con, like Comic Con but all about Prince, which is a really great idea and definitely something to think about in the future. He showed us a t-shirt design he had done using Jurassic Park, but replacing it for Paisley Park, with the Jeff Goldblum classic tagline, "Life finds a way," now saying "Funk finds a way." Well, it wasn't the only Jeff Goldblum line from that film that would be quoted tonight. Finally, the event got underway. Host for the evening was a young lady, Diana Roger, who was likeable enough and very enthusiastic, and wore a ridiculous pair of heels that I feared for her safety walking on and off the stage. What followed was an hour of total bemusement and head-scratching, as a few poets and an unforgettable music performance, unforgettable for the wrong reasons, transpired before our eyes. The poets were obviously talented in their own right, especially one lady, Vanessa Kissel, who has won multiple awards, but the problem was none of it had anything to do with Prince. No poems about him, no poems inspired by him, no anecdotes from the performers about what Prince meant to them or why he inspired them. Nothing. As the realization began to sink in as to what we were witnessing, Jurassic Park sprang to mind again. I leaned over to Mr. Purple Music and said, "Now eventually you might have dinosaurs on your dino tour, yes?" There was a break in between the acts, and a DJ who did play some Prince music, but basically just played the hits, Sexy MF, I Wanna Be Your Lover, etc. And when he played Purple Rain, he made the cardinal sin of cutting it off before the guitar solo, as it was time for the show to continue. Bad timing indeed. There was a performance from a young Latvian lady who was trying to promote an EP she was releasing, and it was, well, interesting to say the least. Between her leg kicking and strange yelping, we really were about as far away from Prince as you can get. It was interesting, as during these performances, some of Prince's pictures that were appearing behind them had very apt expressions. Not on purpose, of course, just a weird coincidence. This whole part of the evening was such a missed opportunity, and it was so disappointing. This book is a one-off, it's never going to happen again, so to cock up its launch like this was almost unforgivable. We did, of course, get to hear from Dan Pipenbring for about an hour, who basically went over what he has already written in the book, and I'll share some footage I shot on my phone at the end of this video. But yet again they failed by not giving enough time for this section, as even Dan was surprised and said, "Oh, is that it?" when it was time to wrap up. The audience, full of die-hard Prince fans and content creators with so much knowledge, were not given any time or opportunity to ask any questions. Looking back on the evening, they could have scrapped the poets and just had 2 hours of Q&A with Dan and even Ashvin. They could have showed the footage from the Paisley Park launch with the book, which by all accounts was way better. Just by reaching out and asking the community for input, they could have come up with a much more rewarding and satisfying experience, and something fitting and worthy of Prince. As it is, they just didn't know what they were dealing with, and the Violet Reality summed it up well in their online review by saying that it felt like the first half of the show was something that was already planned and going ahead anyway, and they just tacked on the Prince book launch, possibly to help finance it. The anger really set in after the event, and as Mr. Purple Music headed off home into the chilly November night, I grabbed a coffee with the Nightchild in a local McDonald's, and we discussed what a missed opportunity this was. Once again, something that could have been so good and so worthy of Prince was a letdown and a disappointment. There is never going to be another Prince memoir, and you let the moment slip through your fingers. The next morning, I awoke to a poem on my WhatsApp from a dear friend, but the author of the poem goes by the name The Dayman. Let me recite it for you before you watch the footage from last night. An auditorium with steps like a coliseum. £25 per head for those wanting to see 'em. 1,000 shoes thumped on the wood for something they needed, but a tiny doubt seeded, their desire may lay unheeded. Noble artists seized their glory chance to spit metaphors, alliterate and dance. It was not their fault that they knew not of the vault, of a guy from Mini who hated mobile phones, had funk in his bones, fought for what he owns. Snapshots of the man, but his essence somehow diluted, now a product to be interpreted by the mainstream. Not the icon who wrote in a dream, was always heard and seen. The strangely cruel twist, easily missed. The artist who sought creative reparation, now neatly and tightly constrained by thus corporation. From slave to rave, first dance to last, heartbreaking chance, a visionary who gave us so much, was being wrenched from our touch, subtly, slowly, through lack of care, no attempt to dare, his being simply not there. Maybe we're still grieving, maybe it's still too raw, but 1,000 eyes spoke unwritten volumes last night through the mist of their confusion. Their thoughts battered, aching and sore, their minds simply uttered, will there be any dinosaurs on this dino tour?
If you're going to translate more of what we believe we knew about him through the connections we individually, collectively had with him.
Yeah, I'll certainly try. I try never to be a Prince whisperer or a Prince expert because, no one could ever predict what he would say or do. And in the course of this process, in the brief 3-month time that I knew him, anything I ever tried to predict about him was always wrong. So it may well still be the case that I'm getting him wrong even now. So just have to see.
So what we're going to do, we know how the story ends. We know how it also begins in so much as your relationship with him. That the idea of Prince writing a book seemed fanciful but not impossible.
Mm-hmm.
That his further retreat from the mainstream also led to him really contemplating, losing a lot of people, but contemplating his place in the world and watching as elements of his own childhood found repetition, state violence, and just adjusting to where he is. So he makes this decision to actually write the book.
Yes.
Now, you participated in what I've called the author auditioning process, and you open the book discussing that. Could you summarise how it was that you came to come into his orbit?
Yes, it all started in November of 2015, so 4 years ago, almost to the day actually. I met up with my literary agent who let it slip that he had the great privilege of working with Prince on what was then a very inchoate book. It wasn't even going to be a memoir, and he knew that Prince was going to need some kind of a co-writer, so I reached across the table and I grabbed him by the lapels and I said, "Damn it must be me." And he said, "Okay, it won't be you." Because I was 29 years old and I'd written 0 books. And usually when one's looking for a collaborator, one wants someone who's written maybe just a single book, half of a book.
You've proven your stripes, isn't it?
I've tried to, yeah. And as it turned out, Prince was looking for someone who had written exactly 0 books. I was right on the money.
So what was his rationale for that? I know you explained in the book, but...
Yes, I think he was very wary of anything that kind of smacked of the establishment. And with something like a celebrity memoir, there's a template, There are certain kind of boilerplate stories that end up working their ways into these things, like a redemption story, a rags to riches tale, or something salacious or scandalous. And I think he just wanted someone who would not at all subscribe to these reigning ideas about what a book had to have in it or how the process should go. He wanted someone who was basically going to sit next to him and buckle up beside him and go somewhere utterly uncharted. And I think he thought that could only be done with someone who was young and something of a novice. And he also enjoyed really nurturing young talent. He liked finding new people and taking them under his wing. And in part, I think that's because he did enjoy being in control, but he also enjoyed keeping people on their toes. There was a certain short list of established writers who people quietly assumed would get this job. And the one time we talked about it, we were in Australia, and he was just kind of laughing to himself. And he's like, "Oh man, once we announce this, then they're going to wonder, like, why you?" And he took so much delight, and I think just now.
And that you wouldn't be here defending his decision.
Yes, yeah. I think he just enjoyed knowing that people would raise their eyebrows and be like, wait, what?
But we need to fill in some gaps. So after you manhandled your agent.
Yes, that is where we left off.
Yeah. So your name was submitted.
Yes, and once we learned that Prince wanted someone with precisely my lack of qualifications, I was asked to write a personal statement for him, which I submitted that the same day it was asked of me in January of 2016. And then within 48 hours, his camp had gotten back to us, and I was on a plane to Minneapolis from Brooklyn, where I live, to meet him for the first time. And that was really how it all started.
So in less than 3 days, this all comes into being.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're on this plane,
Mm-hmm.
and so tell us about this statement. I know you summarized some of it in the book, and I wondered, he's edited this because he doesn't want us to know everything. I'm not going to ask him to reread it, but essentially you had to justify your knowledge of him.
Yes. Yeah, I think he just wanted to see how people would write about him, why they liked him, and why they thought they would be capable of executing this very impossible task of collaborating with him. And I wanted to reprint the whole thing in the book, but my editor wisely cut out some of the parts where I was really just sort of bowing down to him. But I think eventually the whole thing will come out somewhere. It was really very heavy on flattery. I compared him to Mozart. and I stand by that. He is a Mozart figure. But the line that I began with was, when I listen to Prince, I feel like I'm breaking the law. And I was pretty proud of that line, to be honest with you.
And then you met him.
And then I met him.
And he said, what about that line?
First of all, he made me read it aloud, which is itself... No matter how good you think your writing is, once you're performing it for its intended audience, it diminishes in quality rapidly. And since that is the first line, by the time I got to the end of it, I had not gotten all that far into the statement, and he was already saying, now let me stop you right there. Why did you write that about me? And he proceeded to tell me that he didn't believe his music was law-breaking at all, that he aspired to live in harmony. And I should set the scene here. We were in the conference room at Paisley Park, which is in Chanhassen, about 40 minutes out of Minneapolis. And it is a very quiet place. It's something of a sanctuary. And I had thought that Prince would be meeting me with an aide or some sort of business manager, because there had been a lot of people involved in putting together this meeting, but he was alone. It was just the two of us in this room. And I remember the silence and the smell of the scented candles in it, and his conference table, which had his symbol etched into it, which made him like the coolest CEO. And that silence was just so intimidating, but so inviting at the same time, because I started to think that as much as I'd listened to Prince, he had always been surrounded by music, and this was really the first time I had the pleasure of encountering him with no accompaniment at all, which made it really scary when he asked me why I'd written that line, because there was no music to kind of fall into and escape into. And he said that this was all by design. This harmony of Paisley Park was totally aligned with how he made his music, how he lived his life, and of course with his religious views, that there was always this kind of almost platonic ideal of harmony that he was aspiring to, and music that was law-breaking to him would be more like Led Zeppelin or something that used what he referred to as the devil's tritone, which is this idea in music theory of a certain kind of dissonance that he didn't subscribe to at all in his own work. So, long story short, I was wrong.
And he corrected you there.
He did, yes.
But I'm not going to compare you to John Steinbeck or anything, but you didn't come into this, you had a literary agent. That means you have credentials of your own. You weren't completely a fan who were just submitting wildly to, you work for Paris Review, you work for the New Yorker.
That's right.
So you're there unaccompanied with Prince.
Mm-hmm.
I presume in the trip over, you start to think about what it is you knew about him personally and how many threads would have to be tethered together.
Yes.
And the enormity of the project, given the fact that we don't know what the unknowns are.
Right.
The known unknowns, the unknown.
Yes.
Did the enormity of the project not daunt you in any way?
Yes, yeah, I felt very small before it, and if I had to have guessed at that point, I didn't think I would get the job. I thought he would want to collaborate with someone who was black or a woman or from the Twin Cities. He had a kind of set of characteristics that he really prized in his collaborators, and I didn't have any of those. So that was the first of many things that I failed to accurately predict. But you're right, that there was no telling really what he would want to get into first, and he's also famously very mercurial. He would change his mind a lot. And I remember thinking that the very worst thing would be to embark on this project with him and to have him change his mind halfway through and say that he no longer wanted to write a book. And that's why in my statement, the part of it that he didn't despise, I wrote about how a good memoir is not going to be this demystifying thing, that it was always going to retain some air of enigma about it. And I think he was really attracted to that idea because there is a fear that the phrase "tell-all memoir" is bandied about a lot, and there was no way, even if he tried, that he could ever write something like that. He could have given us a 12-volume autobiography, and I think at the end of it we would still be like, I wonder who that guy was. That's really confusing.
But we have to talk about the issue of race, obviously, because Prince he's one of those party arguments where people say, well, rock and roll is this. It's like, no.
Yes.
Wait a minute. When we talk about the legacy of artistry, when we talk about the way in which radio, American as well as British, is segmented into genre, the way in which musical history is rewritten to present rock as beginning with amplification. And we need to think about the legacy, the attachment to blues, Prince's own studious relationship with funk. Mm-hmm. And some of the publicity last week, apart from who doesn't like Ed Sheeran and Katy Perry, was that he wanted the book to be a leveler in relation to race, possibly initiate a conversation about race.
Yes.
So the fact that you are white, and the fact that he could talk about his blackness within the context of the whitening of rock by the industry.
Yes.
The fact that he wanted to impose a real level of reactivation to self-pride in black people. Did you and he have a conversation about the fact that you're white, he wanted to do this, and he wanted to talk in a way that black people would get?
We did, and it came up very often, actually. At first, he confirmed what I had suspected, that he didn't think I was right for the job because I was a white writer, and he wanted to work with someone who had experienced racism firsthand, and he knew that that was not the case with me. I'm still somewhat... he never explicitly said why, in spite of that, he did choose to work with me. It's part of the mystery of this whole thing. But I think he was very attracted to a comparison I made between book publishing and the music industry. I wondered why he was going to work with a big publishing house. In America, the book is published by Random House, which is one of the biggest of the big. And I wondered why he wanted to do that, because so much of the approach to intellectual property that he abhorred in record labels, and so much of the exploitation of black artists that he had seen by Warner Brothers and other labels, really was invented by book publishers centuries before. The whole start of copyright and revenue streams, royalties, who controls the dissemination of the information, that all really came out of books. And I think he wasn't expecting me to make that comparison and to kind of challenge him on that point. And it really opened up our conversation. And he said, oh, I can see myself writing that. Like, you may be wondering why I'm working with this guy. And I think that began it. But race and its relation to the music industry, its relation to the Billboard charts and the equivalent here in the UK, these were things he could not help but return to. They were really kind of the fundamental trauma of his career, and he felt that from a very early age he had been unfairly pigeonholed when he knew that he could be so many things to so many different people. There was always, from the start, someone higher up, a kingmaker would be his word, someone who was looking down and saying, you belong in this box. And he wanted the book to teach its readers that you should always adamantly deny that kind of thinking, and that he had only been able to get to where he was by denying it, by fighting it, and by trying to create a world where it just didn't exist.
You said you said a number of quite beautiful things in your introduction, and towards the conclusion of your introduction, you said that the intention of this book was never to puncture the veil of mystery. But so many people's approaches to memoirs and autobiography is to find that link between our imagination, evoked by his creativity, that we understand that when we heard that song in that time, how it christens that memory, that we understand that he gets everything.
Yeah.
But the revelation was never to actually fully present us with print. Would that be a fair summary? That we were never going to get that?
I think so, yeah. And as I was saying earlier, I think even if he had stated that as his ambition, which he never did and I don't think ever would, it would have been impossible. The veil was so much a part of him, and I think really part of the joy of putting together the book after he died was seeing how really from the age of 18 or 19 when he got his first record deal, he was already busy at figuring out how much he could show and how with little changes of his facial expression, with certain musical flourishes, he could raise as many questions as he was answering. And one thing he told me, thinking about his parents' divorce, but also I think more generally, was that there's some part of your heart that you should never give away, that you should keep as your own. Because if you give it all away, that's it, there's nothing left. And people will try to take everything from you unless you cherish this one kind of unbreakable piece of yourself and keep it close to you. And I think as much as that applied to his life and love, it applied to his whole creative life. So I think going into this book, even though he did want to correct the record, he wanted people to learn certain facts about his life, he wanted to pay his debt to his parents and to Minneapolis, he was never going to try to offer a kind of critical explanation of himself. He really was very wary of what he called white critical terms and kind of obituary-style summative writing. So in that introduction, I tried to steer clear of any sort of interpretive act and just to relay the things he told me as plainly as possible without trying to characterize them or think about how they might fit into his career at large.
So your relationship with him lasted for 3 months, and there were 3 key interview sessions or meetings,
right,
in 3 different locations.
Yes.
2 countries, 3 different locations. Mm-hmm. So there's one that you just described, and then you get the gig. Did you get drunk that weekend? Did you just how did you celebrate the fact that you were going to write co-writers?
Well, I think the celebration actually came with him the second night when we went to go see Kung Fu Panda 3. And I knew that if he was inviting me to see this movie with him and his band, I was in pretty good shape.
You were in
Yeah. So I didn't even care that I missed Kung Fu Pandas 1 and 2. I was like, all right.
For babysitting children of a local teacher. By 11, he went to Woodstock with his father.
Yeah.
And that's when his father started to take his relationship with music seriously, that he wasn't just a boy who liked music, but there was a connection. He sees Santana. He sees him.
Yes.
And then by 19, he's recording his own album. And it's released at 20.
Yes, it's a light speed period of growth for him. And I think that his father was so critical in that kind of quick adoption of music and in endowing him with this kind of sponge-like autodidactic nature where he could suddenly learn, 27 or 28 instruments for his first album. And that moment where he sees Woodstock with his father is one of the most beautiful things he writes about, I think, because there's this great kind of, it causes the end of any sort of condescension between them. And suddenly his father is looking at him as this peer, this musical equal. And you can tell, even from a vantage of many decades later, how much that moved Prince and how he felt that maybe the depiction of his father that comes through in Purple Rain completely lacked that power to it.
I mean, there's a reason that we see a lot of similarities with the highly skilled, the audaciously confident, and their depiction of their own sex and sexuality, their sensuality.
Mm-hmm.
And he gives mention to the fact that his parents, well, his mother suffered domestic violence at the hands of his father, that he went to live with his father at a later date, but that his stepfather wasn't too sure how best to approach giving the Birds and Bees talk, so just gave him, you can take it.
Yes, yeah. His stepfather was the one who would take him to R-rated movies and these kind of things, and would give him very kind of basic lectures about sexuality that had no real care for the sensuality of the act, but were kind of anatomical, I guess, or just reductive. And his father didn't seem to be helping either necessarily on that count. And meanwhile, he claimed in an interview earlier in his career that his mother would leave dirty novels and erotic magazines lying around. So from the detritus of the sexuality of his elders, he's almost stitching together this very unique approach to sexuality in his own way. And I was so delighted that he spoke about this or wrote about it at all. And I remember leafing through those pages as I read them in Melbourne and getting to one where the header was just puberty. And I was like, okay, he's going to go there. This is good. Yeah.
But at the same time, the emotion of the dysfunction in his family, the way in which his and his sister's identity was weaponized, for want of a better word, by their mother in order to try and salvage the relationship.
Yes.
The depth of his perceptiveness about her perspective, his father's, his own, that ends up leaping as much into his identity, his performative, his lyrical identity. And he knows this, but the fact that he's dialing it back
Yes.
to quite scenic topics and scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have conversations about sex, sexuality, the influence of parents, their sex and sexuality?
Yes, I mean, we touched on all those things, maybe not as explicitly as we should have, but I know that the last time I spoke with him, which was 4 days before he died, he was still rehashing that violence between his mother and his father. And he called it the central dilemma of his life. And one of the quotations that's been appearing here throughout the night is the one where he says, I like order, finality, and truth. That would be his dad. But if I'm at a fancy dinner party and the DJ puts on something funky, he's going to have to dance. And, well, that does seem like a very reined-in way of addressing what you just brought up. I think it's all kind of there, humming below the surface. This feeling that the violence he had witnessed between two people who made him meant that within himself there was this kind of irreconcilable tension. And I think you do see that in the way he treats sex in his music. You see it in his reverence of what he called the feminine principle as the rudiment of community building. This idea that women first and foremost are the ones in the community who look out for each other, who spread the news, who are forming some kind of web that will serve as a defense against any threat that the community faces, while the men are given over to testosterone and kind of chest thumping.
And he talks beautifully about funk.
Yes.
James Brown is his favourite singer.
Oh, he loved James Brown, yeah.
He talks about how a word is shaped in the mouth and the velocity or subtlety that a word is sung with. That is what characterises a funky singer or not. The way in which the velocity of its delivery is encased in the funk.
Yeah, there's so much of this book that serves as a kind of rudimentary funk philosophy, and he told me he wanted to write a lot of books. I think had he lived, he absolutely would have. And I think one of them would have had to be just a kind of grammar of funk. And I use the word grammar because he would talk about needing to invent new words for it. We have to find a word for what funk is. And he was great with neologism. There's a few in the book, like normality, memoir, and just a love of language and its precision. But his feelings on funk, it was a treat to talk to him and then to go see these piano and a microphone shows that he was playing in those last months, because he would kind of draw out those same ideas on stage, and you could feel the way that just being at the piano was helping him think through what he meant by these things. He said to me in our first meeting that funk is the opposite of magic. Funk is about rules. And on stage at the piano and the microphone show, he would say that funk is about space. How much space you're able to leave between notes, that's how funky it is, or how funky it isn't. And I think he really was convinced that funk, in a way, was a vehicle for all these problems we've discussed: the violence in his family, the violence he saw in his community, the question of who owns something. It could all be given expression toward this medium of music that really fuses so much orderliness to improvisation.
I also think, and I'm really interested in obviously some of the conversations that did manifest in some of his notes to you that would have made it to the book, so forgive me if I'm remembering that kind of approach. But I'm really interested in the links between his evolving maturation, how it would look, because funk and funk musicians, especially male funk musicians, they would challenge the visual presentation of male blackness.
Yes.
And so you would have Rick James with cycles, and you'd have, obviously, with his incarnation as Dr. Funkenstein, who had George Clinton and some fire jobs.
Right.
So by the time we get to the third album that Prince makes, he's performing in London in a thong.
Yes.
There's some evidence of pubic hair. We're there.
Yes.
Front and centre. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's more than evidence if you're front and center.
And his hair's hot pressed. There's that there's a willing determination confrontation with men who sound like this, that hard, are not supposed to look like that.
Yes.
And that has lots of references to his parents, very stylish people, very, very aware.
Yes.
This is the 1980s, so when I'm talking about the 60s. So what did you discuss this? Because I'm also interested in the way in which this morphs into the kind of sartorial look of the Prince, the band, the revolution. Everybody they have a visual stamp.
Yes. He was so fastidious and precise about appearances, about sartorial choices of any kind. And I'm glad you pointed out that point in the pages where he writes about watching his mother and father get dressed to go out. Because to me, the ability with which he could summon the exact details of the shirts his father was wearing and how they would be framed by his sharkskin suit. I mean, you can see everything about how Prince dresses and the degree to which he prizes good dressing in that moment, I think. And immediately after his parents leave, he's in his head, he's in this imaginative life, and it's almost as if the two start to run together. He would talk about keeping lists and kind of projecting himself into the future, and I think he was always thinking, how am I going to look? What will I be wearing? And we did talk a lot about how in these last years of his life he had turned back to wearing his afro. And there had been an incident with a rock critic in Minneapolis, John Bream, who covered Prince throughout his career, where John Bream had said, like, I think Prince is wearing a wig. And he had sat down with Bream, I think the last time they met, and pointed at him and just said, you can see it's not a wig, John. And I think he felt that it was so important to return to that style that he had also embraced in his early life, because at the same time in his music making he was looking back into the 70s maybe more deeply than he ever had before. I think Hit and Run Phase 2 is a kind of love song to the Ohio Players and Rufus and Chaka Khan and all of these performers that he writes about in the memoir pages. James Brown too, of course, but he's everywhere in the catalog. And I think he felt that by wearing his hair this way and dressing in these kind of loose tops with these flared sleeves, he was going back in time in a way, and that's the title of his album that he produced for Judith Hill, Back in Time. So I think these things were always playing on certain themes in his mind.
There was less discussion about his romantic relationships. I know that you were curtailed, obviously, by his death, but also by the fact that you had these fixed meetings.
Yeah.
Did he discuss his relationships? I know that there was that protect your neck, protect your heart. But he was married, he'd had a son who died very early.
That is, of all the things I could have spoken with him about, I think at the very top of the list. I think his first wife, Maite, writes about it gorgeously in her own memoir, but I never got the chance to speak with him about it. And to me, it's kind of the great unprocessed trauma of his whole life. And more than anything, I wish that we could have unpacked it, but it was so tender, I think, so close to the bone that,
You'd take some time to get there.
Yes. Yeah. My first priority was always just to keep him talking about whatever he wanted to say, again, out of the fear that maybe he would turn on his heel at some point and say, there shall be no book, which would have been really sad.
But you were looking back, you're conscious that he wielded this authoritatively, even after the contract was signed.
Yes, he certainly did. And he would never let me take him either. And I pretend, I would always say, and I don't know if it would be true, but I wanted to work up the courage to say, I think we need to record these conversations, even if it's you who is keeping the tapes, and in fact to come to you to kind of access them. Because I thought if his voice was going to be reproduced on the page with any veracity or authenticity, we would have to have a recording of it. And we never got that far, unfortunately.
So, in this country, it became a kind of mainstream tradition to laugh at Prince. To laugh at Prince when he pointed out that a record company owns his name, like a slave master would have owned him centuries before. That if he wanted to do something with the music that he created, solely envisaged, that he had to ask, that he had more music coming out of him that could ever be released. And somebody would say, we're only going with one track. When he changed his name, and mainstream media was mocking him here, calling him Squiggle, and
yes.
when he'd appear at the Brit Awards, and he jumped on the back of his bodyguard.
Yes, Big Chick.
Big Chick walks up onto the stage. It's all performative.
Right.
But what we have now in the age of streaming, everyone's like, Jay-Z's got his masters, and Rod Stewart sold all of his.
Yeah.
That's still stunned, isn't it? Even though he, and he worked legally with his former manager, he secured his own work. He got his masters. Did you talk extensively about that battle with noise?
Yes. In fact, I feel like whenever there was a lull in the conversation, that would be the thing that he was likeliest to return to, is this question of who knows what he had lost in the ensuing decades before he had those masters back, and by signing contracts that in retrospect he felt were unduly binding and exploitative. And he worried about this not just for the sake of himself, but for the massive array of artists that he had mentored, and just for creatives generally. And when he described the book as something that he hoped would be a handbook for the beautiful community, what he was talking about was something that would inspire people not to accept deals that took their power away from them, and really to redefine intellectual property. He told me that he still was not altogether sure how many copies of Purple Rain had sold, that he had no real reliable indicator of that, as presumably he would have if it was something that he really controlled top to bottom. And he would say that he wanted to go into a meeting with Warner Brothers and say, why don't you make me the president of your label, just to see how they would react. And to say, like, I think you're all racist, just to go into a board meeting and tell them all, I think you're racist. And I think these were things that he couldn't help but kind of ruminate on, because he felt that he had been grandfathered into this system, that even though he had reclaimed his masters, even though he had done, I think, a great service in the 90s by changing his name to a symbol and drawing attention to all these things, they were just never going to be resolved to his satisfaction. He'd spent too much of his creative life in the shadow of these arrangements, I guess.
So, the fact that Prince can play so, I'm sort of that he could play so many instruments.
Yes.
It's really depicted in the photo book that you found, that you discovered in the archive, and how that relates to that kind of cycles and illustrates some of the frustrations, some of the pretty basic living that was taking place as he was trying to work on this album.
Yeah.
And he takes a photograph is taken from his balcony, and there's iron railings, and he calls that prison. So he was doing that in 1920. He was already aware of what was ahead, and yet he pushed through because there was no other way to be heard, to get his talent out there.
I love that. One of the great pleasures of compiling that section of the book, and of finding these photos and this kind of record that he had left of his early life, is that you do see that far from being something that came out in the 90s when he changed his name to the symbol, he really was focused on retaining total control of
one of
his
the
art
tracks
from the first, from when he was 19. And that shot where he's just signed this historic 3-album deal with Warner Brothers. He's in California for, I think, the first time ever, one of the first times. And he's saying, view from the cell I was in when I signed the first record contract. I mean, that is prescient, almost, about everything that would follow. And I know that in setting up those first 3 albums, and For You, the self-titled one, and Dirty Mind, he always did worry that the label was trying to take something from him, that what they would say was a kind of paternalism for a young artist he regarded as a sort of undue influence.
He also has a picture of his first check.
Yes.
And an Afro coat.
Yes. He took a lot of pictures of that first check, and I felt that we had to include the one that also had an Afro pick in it. It's like he learned how to stage it as he went. He's like, wait, one more. Bring me the Afro pick.
Now, you mentioned the fact that, one of the most observant, one of the many observant things you made the point of was that he would tell you where to sit.
Yes.
Here, do this.
Yes.
It felt like an invitation, but it was always an instruction.
Yes. Very well said.
I'm quite interested in the community of mentees that he surrounded himself with. People he encouraged musically, people who were collaborators, and how that relationship changed. Years ago I interviewed Rosie Gaines, years ago I interviewed Shepard Carr, both of whom I've worked with. They have different memories from their time, but they were all doing when they were established musically. And you have artists like Sheila Reid, Wendy Lizzie, and so many different band inclinations. But I'm really interested in the way in which his musical orchestration is visionary, not his visionary, not just for himself, but for others and for women. Could you talk about that a little bit? Is it fully fleshed out yet because of the time constraint?
Yes, yeah. We didn't get into it too much, but I think it was something I saw him do more unconsciously than anything in moments like the one where you pointed out. He would tell me where to sit or just when we were meeting. And I think when he would revert to certain motifs or themes that he always kind of fell back on, like his his feeling that the music industry was oppressive, he always had other people in mind. And he was very proud of Judith Hill when I hung out with him. He was very proud of Esperanza Spalding. I remember him saying that he had listened to her record and that it sounded like a chorus from heaven, and then that it would be suddenly pierced with this dissonance and he couldn't figure out how the chords worked and everything. So he was always alert to new talent, always keeping tabs on the many people that he had helped over the years. But we didn't get into too much detail about what it took from him to give that gift. I can say that one thing I've read from a lot of people who've worked with him is that there would come a moment where he would lock eyes with them and tell them to do something seemingly basic that actually sounded impossible. In the case of, I'm thinking of Gwen Stefani, who he once told, like, why don't you just write a hit song?
Oh, ouch.
And yeah, it sounds like it's great advice to give, maybe not so helpful. It doesn't come so easily at all. But then she just went out and did it. There was something he could convey just by telling you these things that are almost considered tactless and polite company, you know? He would just be like, no, forget all that. Like, we're talking about music here. You're just going to write a hit song. So go do it. And then he would go do it.
I like one of the break made where you were at an event with him and the DJ was playing and he just told the DJ, always end your Earth, Wind and Fire's September.
Yes. Yeah. That's great advice.
At the end of the night, they really completed their session. Next time.
Yeah. Next time. But yeah, he had that way about him, and I think he was growing into this sort of elder statesman role. That's part of what the philosophy of funk was about, and part of these bits of advice he was able to dispense. I mean, he had been in the public eye for such a long time and from such a precocious age that I think he was realizing that there was so much to do, so much instruction that he could offer, even in small things. And it was a source of enormous calm. It was almost a generosity. I mean, to enter a room with him and be like, oh God, I'm in a room with Prince, and he's just like, sit there. You're like, oh, thank God, now I know where to sit. That is one less problem.
But did you ever, like, give into the vanity, like, you were walking and you were part of the entourage? Did you have to balance? Did you ever, oh my goodness.
Oh, how could you not? I just wish I had his shoes. I mean, his sneakers would light up, you know, so it didn't matter how much I was bouncing in my step, they were watching his, you know.
You never played basketball?
What's that? No, nor even ping pong. He's an exceptional ping pong player by all accounts. My girlfriend thinks she could have beat him, but I think she's wrong.
It's an easy revision. So you open with news about his death.
Yes.
And you say something here that what I found unendurable in one context was beautiful to me in another, where you're recalling in Melbourne how he was talking about he dreams a lot. He was dreaming a lot. He was seeing his dead friends.
Mm-hmm.
And when the news emerged of his relationship, for want of a better word, with fentanyl, that you were understanding that so much of that sorrow, which sounded quite poetic and evocative, sounded like somebody who was kind of resigned to a future that they weren't too enthralled with.
Yes.
So essentially, were you almost alerted by his death to the fact that although you only knew him for 3 months, that what you knew was as controlled as our own distance from him?
Yes, yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I don't think there was anything false about how he portrayed himself to me. I think the joy that he exuded and his excitement at working in this new medium and his kind of natural ability as a writer, those were all totally authentic. But I do think, as with all of us, there was, there was a sadness there and a melancholy, something that he never would have showed to me, but that you can see kind of refracted through certain things that he said that were published after his death. And in a way, reading about those really only completed the portrait for me, or deepened the portrait, I guess. Because I do think there was a kind of confluence between this ruminative thinking he had about dreaming and seeing his dead friends when he was dreaming, and the pain that he was, in retrospect, clearly in that time. And then his desire to reflect on his past, too. And there's all of those things kind of swirl together in a way that I don't think I'll ever be able to parse entirely, and that makes me really sad if I think about it too much. But I think it was helpful for me, I think, and sobering for me to realize that I had been so guileless in my encounters with him.
You also mentioned the very first meeting in that office, that candle smelled great. But you also mentioned that he took you down in the lift, and that was a lift that his body was found.
That's right. And yeah, I was so shocked to read that, because not just that lift, but the entirety of Paisley Park and Prince, when he was in it, had this kind of peace radiating through him. I mean, one thing he wrote in the book and told me to write down was that music is healing, and I know he believed that with every fiber of his being. And if music is healing and he is kind of musical in his every gesture, then he is kind of healing. So to see the word fatality associated with that elevator where I had seen him bouncing on the balls of his feet, it was just incongruous and kind of incomprehensible.
Dan, our time is now up.
Oh, I thought we were just getting started.
I know. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work with